Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, dear elders of the community, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by thanking the trustees of the Birmingham Jamaat for giving me the opportunity to talk about our migration from India to Uganda in the years 1900 to 1972. It is my pleasure and privilege to talk about this topic as we go back into the history to honor and respect our elders who have paved the way for us and for future generations by their hard work. And secondly, I think we can look at those historic years and learn from it the lessons that we can pass on to our future generations. In starting my presentation, I would like to present a few caveats. The first caveat is that the information I've gathered and the comments I have are all seen through my lens. Secondly, the presentation is based on the oral traditional history passed on from generation to generations, and the story is not fully complete. I am trying to set up a framework to set up the story so that we can finally complete it with more facts, figures, and actual documentary evidence. And thirdly, I would like to mention at the start that I will be referring to our community elders by their proper name for the clarity of purpose and for historical perspective. Although a lot of the elders are related to me, and I should refer to them by my relative and relationship name. Thank you. Now, I've made my presentation under the following headings. 1, the critical events and dates. Number 2, where we come from, our homeland. Number 3, migration motivation. Why did our people get motivated to migrate? And number 4, the migration to Uganda in different phases. And number 5, conclusion and lessons learned. So on the critical events, I think the first event we should establish is when was Uganda as a country created. So the history books tell us that on June 18th, 1894, the British government declared that Uganda would come under British protection as a protectorate. The gentleman British official who negotiated these agreements was a fellow by the name of Gerald Portal. And the British government later on honored him by naming a town in Uganda with which a lot of you are familiar. That town is Fort Portal. The second event that we should note is that the British East Africa Company was granted a charter in 1888, which led to the colonization of present-day Kenya. So I'm mentioning Kenya at this time because Kenya and Uganda are bordering to each other, and Kenya is on the east side of Uganda. The third event that we should look at is how do we access Uganda? And the British government, when right after the start of the colonization in 1888 of Kenya, commissioned the construction of a railway line from Mombasa to the westernmost point in Kenya, which at that time was Kisumu. And that railway construction started, as a lot of you know, and a lot of the labor was provided by Indians in those days who were commissioned to go to East Africa to build the railway line. The railway line to Kisumu was completed on 19th of December 1901. And that's a significant event because Lake Victoria, which was discovered by Richard Burton in the 1850s, was a big body of water in the middle of Africa. And it joined several communities that lived around it. So when the British and the Europeans discovered it, they put steamships on Lake Victoria, which then traveled from one place to another. And soon, Kisumu became an important port, and on the east coast of the Lake Victoria, and on the northern coast was Port Bell, which is next to Kampala, only about 8 miles or so from Kampala. And then on the west coast, we had Bukoba, and on the southern coast of Lake Victoria, we have Mwanza and Musoma. So all those communities were joined by the steamships, but still the problem was how to get the goods from the coast, Mombasa or Dar es Salaam, to the hinterland. So the construction of railway was important. But 1901 was an important date because now the line to Kisumu was done, and the goods can then be put on the ship and taken to other parts by ship on Lake Victoria. So the next event that again relates to the railway line was that the line to Kampala was completed in 1931. And again, as you see, our migration in the 1930s, people are starting to come to Uganda very easily because the railway line from Mombasa was clear and was operating fully. So this was the idea of opening up the interior of Africa. The idea was to open up for business and trade the interior of Africa, and to do that, one of the avenues was to have business people or entrepreneurs come from India and start setting up shops and businesses so that British goods can be sold to the natives, and the raw materials that are produced by the natives could be processed and sent overseas. So now, that is the background of what was happening in Africa. But let's go back to our homeland and see where we come from. So when you look at the Google Maps, you look at the map of Gujarat, and you see on the northern section of Gujarat is Kathiawar, and the towns that we come from, and I'll mention a few of the main towns, are Bed, Balamba, Drol, Haryana, Jamnagar, Jodia, and Rajkot. So these are the towns that are on the border of the northern part of Gujarat, which border onto the Indian Ocean, and on the other side is the province of Kutch. So all these towns are within 50 to 70 miles radius of each other. So they were not very far from each other, and our communities back in India knew each other from the different towns. Actually, some of the distances were so small that they were almost like suburbs of each other. So, but that's the background of most of our people where they came from. Now, we then go into what was the motivation for our people to leave India and go to remote parts of Africa which they did not know or had not seen before. So when you analyze that, you find that there are always, firstly, the desire to improve one's well-being, okay? So that's obvious. Everybody wants to do that. And but if things are reasonably stable wherever you are, you will probably not move. But the motivation gets more accelerated if the opportunities, economic opportunities, are not there. Now, in India, we also had the social, political, and other factors as well. And the social side, India had the caste system, and which made upward mobility very difficult. And on the political side, in the 1900s, almost the start of the 20th century, there was a lot of movement for independence, and then which led to the split of Congress party into the Muslim League and the Congress party. And so there was a lot of discussion about what would happen to the Muslims living in India and how everything will work out when the British leave. So that was unsettling for a lot of people. But the other two factors that were important for the motivation was that Africa Wala in those days were considered the role models. And people who lived, who were not going to Africa, looked upon these Africa Walas as somebody who made money easily, who lived a life of leisure, and when they came back to India, they were always respected, and they got married in the right circles, and they were admired in all respects. So it was, from perception side, it was, okay, we can also go to Africa and we can become successful. So I think this is only one side of the story, because there were some people who came to Africa and were not very successful. But so be it. The overall impression was people who go to Africa become successful and become rich instantly. So that would have been a motivation. The other part of the motivation was twofold. One is the British government was in India and was in Africa. So the British government was the agent to stimulate immigration from India to Africa. And the British knew what the Indians could do, and they could also see how the African economies could benefit from their input. And the second part, which always important in those days, was what kind of connections you had if you were going to Africa. So if you went to Africa and you knew somebody there, then there were some connections and you can depend on them. So those were the factors motivating our people to go to Africa. And let's look at some of the examples of Africa Walas in those days, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So one of our community members, by the name of Haji Yusuf Karbani, he came out of Georgia and went to South Africa, and it's recorded that in 1874 he established a shop in a village or a town at that time called Dundee, South Africa. And this is documented. So in 1874 he established himself there, and then he continued to live there, and some of his family still live in South Africa, and some are in the UK and elsewhere. He also had a brother by the name of Boda Kandia, who was married to Tayyib Isaaq's sister by the name of Maghi Isaaq. And he had another brother whose name was Tar Muhammad, and he was married to Adam Haji's sister by the name of Sonabai. So the Kandia family at that time was well established in Africa, and they were well respected. Now, they were from Georgia. Now, the respectable names that went to Africa from Haryana were Hussein Ahmad and Wali Muhammad Ahmad, two brothers who went to South Africa and ended up in southern Rhodesia. Then we had Nur Muhammad Alana, who also ended up in southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Suleiman Punja family also went from Haryana. Also from Haryana, we have a pioneer in Kenya by the name of Osman Allu. And Osman Allu himself established himself very well in Kenya and helped a number of our people. Osman Allu was from the Wagir community. And so from Bed, the town of Bed, we also have evidence of a number of people going to South Africa. And that includes Hussein Saleh Muhammad Chucha, Osman Lalai, Omar Chatra, the Chatra family, and even Muhammad Ibrahim Chucha was in South Africa for a short period. So all our relatives had some connections to South Africa at some time, and then East Africa opened up. So let's then follow up to what happened in Uganda. So on the migration phases to Uganda, the first phase I would like to talk about would be from 1901 to 1914. Now, this is the time where we don't have much documentary evidence, because I don't know what kind of passports there were, or if there were any passports, we can't find them. But the evidence that has been passed on indicates that our elder, Tayyab Ishaq, was in Uganda at some time between 1901 and 1910. And that is almost like evidence established that our elder Tayyab Ishaq was in Uganda at that time. Now, also at that time, in Uganda, two cousins came out from Haryana. One was Qasim Lota, and the other one was my grandfather, Fakir Muhammad R.B. Karbani. And the two were related because their mothers were sisters. And they came to Africa, and there are stories that they came and worked for Ali Din Avisram, who at that time was an Ismaili merchant, established Ismaili merchant in Kampala. And from information written about Ali Din Avisram, where I have read it, is that he did track down to Western Uganda and to the Congo. In fact, there is evidence that he and his troops went down to a place called Goma, and the town next to Goma is Gisenyi. Now, interesting thing about this is that Goma is in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Gisenyi is in Rwanda. So, I understand, but I don't know for sure, is that our elder Qasim Lota lived somewhere around the town of Goma. And my grandfather also was in that area, and then he came back to India. And so there is some evidence of these three gentlemen being in Uganda and in that part of the world in the years 1901 to 1910. Now, there's also, there could be also that the Jia brothers, Bolia family, that is Sumar Jia and Hassan Jia, were in Uganda at that time. But that story has to be completed by the families or whoever to know exactly when that happened. So very few people who came out at that time, and you got to remember that Uganda was only established in 1894. So we are only 5-6 years in, and then these 4 names appear, or 3 names appear that they were in Uganda. So that goes on until 1910, and from the evidence we see that our elder Taib Ishaq came back to India and lived in India for a couple of years, was blessed with the twins, Wali Muhammad Tayyab and Yusuf Tayyab, and then it appears he went back to Africa again. And then in 1914, the First World War broke out. So we have the war years from 1914 to 1919, and that's phase 2 in my presentation. But in that war, what we find is that Tanganyika was under the control of the Germans, and the traveling on the Indian Ocean was risky because any ships can be viewed as an enemy ship and could be bombarded by either the British or the Germans. So not many people traveled, and everybody was waiting for the war to end. So whether if you are either stuck in Africa or you are in India and you want to go to Africa, it was not advisable to travel during the war years. So the war ended, and it seemed like after the war, our elder Taib Ishaq came back to India, Haryana. At that time, his eldest son, Habib Tayyab, was about the marriage age. He got married, and it seemed like after Habib Tayyab was married, the father and son and their families traveled back to Africa. And so they came back in the 1920s, and Alhamdulillah, they were blessed with the families and whatnot. So the first evidence of family settlement in Uganda is from 1920s onwards. Now, if there were families settled before that, I have not seen any evidence of that, but maybe there is somewhere some evidence about it. But for sure, our elder Taib Ishaq's family did settle in the 1920s. And it seemed like they were more settled in western Uganda, being Kabale, Buseni, Sema, and Rukungiri. So given that, then we also find that in the 1920s, it seems, that our elder Taib Ishaq facilitated the immigration of his nephew by the name of Ilyas Ismail Ishaq. And so Ilyas Ismail came with his family to Africa in the 20s, and he lived also in the western Uganda. Now we go back to, in this phase in the 1920s, now we go back to the settlement of the Musa Hussein family. And so we say, what is the connection between Uganda and Musa Hussein? And go back into the stories, and we find the stories that Musa Hussein's mother, a lady by the name of Kapuri, so Kapuri grandmother referred to Taib Ishaq as a brother. And so she probably asked her brother Taib Ishaq to sponsor or look after her sons. And I say sons because Kapuri Dadima had been married twice, and from her first marriage, she had a son by the name of Muhammad Badan. And Muhammad Badan was in Africa and was in Uganda. And then Musa Hussein was the son from the second marriage, and he also came to Uganda. And Musa Hussein used to refer to Taib Ishaq as Mama. So that story has got to be further explored, but this is the story or information that I have to date. So that leads us to conclude that Musa Hussein was sponsored by our elder Taib Ishaq and came to Western Uganda as well. Now, remember, Musa Hussein and Muhammad Badan were both from Bed, and which led to another family from Bed coming to Uganda, which was Muhammad Osman's family. And Muhammad Osman, who is the grandfather of my wife, came from Bed at that time with his wife and one child, and then his second child and a daughter was born in Uganda, I think. So there's another family that come from Bed to Western Uganda, and that is all happening in the 1920s. And then we go from there to the family, or to the migration of Adam Haji Chucha, again from Bed. And Adam Haji was the brother-in-law of Muhammad Osman. That means Muhammad Osman's sister was married to him, Juleka Dadima. So Adam Haji also comes to Uganda in the 1920s. Okay, and I don't know whether they came together with Muhammad Osman or he came later. We don't know the exact date, but the family did establish themselves in Uganda. Now, also when we're looking at the 1920s, the Jia brothers, the Sumar Jia Bolia, had two brothers, Hassan Jia and Nur Muhammad Jia. And it seems like Sumar Jia and Hassan Jia both came at the same time in the early 1920s, followed by Nur Muhammad Jia a few years later. So all three brothers were in Uganda in the 1920s, I think. Then in 1930, and then it goes to a personal story related to me, is that my father, Abu Bakr Fakir Muhammad Karbani, left India in 1930 and heading towards Kabale, where Sumar Jia Bolia was living. And Sumar Jia Bolia was my grandmother, my father's mom's first cousin. So he was headed there to establish himself and make a living in Africa. So that all happened in 1920s and the year 1930. Then we see in 1930s, we still have a lot more migration coming from our part, our homeland. And that includes, at some point, Haji Kara, and he was living in Jamnagar, he also came to Uganda. And again, we don't know the exact date. It could be late 20s, early 30s. And then he was followed later on by his son, Ismail Haji Kara. And then also in the 1930s, we find that Yusuf Qasim Lota came to Uganda. He was brought into Uganda by his uncle Qasim Lota, whom we referred to earlier, and he stayed around Buseni and worked a lot with Musa Hussein. Okay, and then also in the 1930s, Qasem Muhammad Chucha from Bed also came to Uganda in the 1930s. We also, and again we don't know the exact date, but Adam Haji's son, Haji Adam, also came to Uganda in the 1930s. And then in 1939, when Musa Hussain went to India for a trip, he came back, and with him was Abu Bakr Abdullah Chucha and Abdul Latif Sumar Bolia. And at that time, these two gentlemen were in their teens, early teens. Okay, so also there is some evidence that Ramzan Isa came at that time or in the 1940s, but I don't know the exact date. But I know Ramzan Isa was sponsored or had the connection because his sister Amina was married to Habib Tayyib from the Tayyib Ishaq family. So also in the 1930s, Muhammad Osman's cousin Abdullah Umar, who is the father of my wife's mother, also came to Uganda, and he also lived in Western Uganda. So that's what happened in the 1930s. And then 1939, the Second World War broke out. And at that time, Tanganyika was no longer under the German rule. Okay, so Tanganyika, after the First World War, was given to Britain, and the Germans gave up all rights on Tanganyika. But in the Second World War, Somalia was under the Italians, and the Italians were fighting in the war against the British. So again, during the war, Indian Ocean travel was risky and was to be avoided. So not much travel was happening, and people were very careful to travel at that time. So immigration was at a minimum. And remember, the British were fighting the war, so they didn't have much time to encourage people from India to go to Africa and establish themselves. So then we go into the 1940s, and we find the migration of Abu Bakr Musa Kandiya family and Abu Bakr Muhammad from Balamba. By the way, Abu Bakr Musa family is from Bed. And then Abdul Shakur Sumar Bolia also followed in the 1940s. And after the war has ended in 1945, that's when my mother and 3 children came in the same group as Haji Adam, his mother Julekha Adam, and Yusuf Adam and Asbai Bai Adam. And also accompanying them at that time was Mrs. Halima Yusuf Qasim. So they came all as a group. And then the next group that came was in about 1947, and that is when Musa Hussain family returned back, and Hussain Umar Chatra came with them at that time, and they came back with Qasem Muhammad Chucha, who had just got married in India. And also at the same time, Ahmed Muhammad Chucha came with them. So that brings us to most of the immigration after the Second World War. And then we also have evidence that in Buseni, we had Suleiman Hassan Bolia, who came in the 1940s to settle in Buseni. But he was in Uganda, I think, in the 1930s, and he went back, and then he came back after the war. He went to Osman Alu's shop in Nyeri, and then he came to Busheni. So that's Suleiman Hassan Bolia. And then we also have Abdul Karim Qasim Lota come to Uganda, come to Busheni in the 1940s. And he was in Kenya first, and then he came to Uganda. There was also, we should mention that at some point, Abdurrahman Dadu Karbani family came and lived in Barara in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And there was the family of Ibrahim Chuma Hakda, who also lived in Busheni for a while. So that takes us to the phase of 1945 to 1948. And as you know, in 1947, India was granted the independence. And India became a separate country, and the British were no longer in both India and Africa. So the immigration became very difficult, and in the phase from 1948 to 1962, we don't see many of our people coming from India to Uganda. The only example I have was in 1955, Mr. Muhammad Hanif Sumar Bolia came to Uganda from India, and he came because I think his family was already established in Uganda in the 1930s, or maybe he was even born in Uganda. So again, that would depend upon the evidence. So 1948 to 1962, not much migration. Now, our people were settling down. The British regime was rule-based, so you had to permit for this and you had to permit for that. And people were making reasonable living, not getting very rich, but making a reasonable living. Now, as you know, in 1958, in the Buganda province, there was a boycott of British goods and Asian shops. And a lot of small businesses in small towns in Buganda owned by Asians went bankrupt because they were barely making a living, and then the boycott just tipped them over and they lost everything. So when people think about Africa being a land of plenty, it was not always so. And we should always remember that perception and reality are two different things. And perception is everybody goes to Africa and becomes rich. In reality, a lot of people were just making a living. So now we go to the final phase, and the final phase is from 1962 to 1972, when the government of Idi Amin decreed or made a ruling as supported by the government that the Asians should leave within 90 days. So if you look at that phase, again, there was not much immigration from India to Uganda, and the British left in 1962, but the policies adopted by the new government were more or less the same as they were before independence. So not much encouragement for newcomers to Africa. But important thing to note is that in this phase from 1962 to 1972, some of our people were leaving Uganda to go to Britain. And there's evidence that at least 3 families had moved to Britain before the expulsion in 1972. The migration from India to Uganda and then expulsion in 1972 is very unique, because usually when people migrate, they settle in one country and live there for a few generations. But in the case of Uganda, we had a lot of people who migrated from India, lived in Uganda for a couple of scores of years, and then migrated again. So it's kind of unique in that respect. Okay, so now Ibrahim Lota will cover the story about our life in the UK, but I'll just conclude by saying what are the lessons we learned by our migration from India to Uganda and from Uganda to Britain. So the first thing is that the political, social, and economic upheavals will happen and continue to happen. And it's not unique that they happen to Ugandans only, they happen all the time. And that's not under our control. So we have to accept whatever happens, we have to accept it as it is. But what are the enduring values that we should, and principles that help us survive those upheavals? So if we look back into how people came to Uganda and what connection they had, and they were cousins, nephews, or whatever, brothers. So I think the family values are very important, okay? And we got to understand what kutum in our Kutchi language means and what are the implications of that. The second value we should understand and espouse is what is a kabila, which is extended family, which is what is our clan. Are we Chucha, Pupar, Kandia, or whatever clan we are. And then from all the clans, we have our community. So that's another valuable part that we should honor and respect. And then from our community, we have the bigger group, which is our ummah of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then after that, we have the whole world, and we are a citizen of the whole global population. So the lesson we should learn is that we should value our families, we should value our being on this earth, we should value our ummah, and we should value our dunya. In conclusion, the message is we should be good role models for future generations and use every opportunity to help and support each other. Thank you very much.